community needs. We are focused on social sciences data, so anything from health to inequalities, psychology sits within our remit. I also wear the research data management hat, as I like to call it. So we have a curated collection that consists of large-scale governmental surveys. I would say annual population survey, the crime survey for England and Wales. They are population representative. They have a weighting in them, so we can actually see how the data applies in real life. But I also overlook our self-deposit repository reshare, which is there especially to support, I would say, smaller sample size studies, either from academic researchers, from charities, NGO organizations, to actually back up publications in future funding as well. Without further ado, I'll start my slides very nicely. So, as I said at the beginning, it's just a brief introduction at what we do at UK Data Service and how we can be of help. We do host the largest collection of social, economic, and population data, and we are funded by the Economic and Social Research Council to ensure that besides access to the data, we actually support, guide, and train users and data producers of social and economic data. We do support the development of best practices for data preservation and data sharing. Within the slides, I have added a lot of links, and the slides will be made available to you in case you have specific questions that you want to read more about. For example, how do I document my data properly? How do I anonymize my data properly? And so on. Both Hina and I are based at the UK Data Archive, which is the lead partner of UK Data Service, and we look after the curated collection that UK Data Service is providing. We are a trusted digital repository, so we have, besides the core Trust Seal certification, we have a few other certifications, such as ISO. We're going to be seeing we actually can provide access to very sensitive data, otherwise known as personal data under current legislation. We have around 9,000 data sets in our collections, and as I've said, discover a wide range of social sciences topics, and roughly we get around 250 data sets in new editions each year. With new editions, we're thinking here about studies that run for a long period of time, either longitudinal or cross-sectional studies. And when they publish a new edition, they have usually done some improvements to their variables. And we're going to see with the data lifecycle, you always improve, and there's always space to improve and to make the data available. We do have 45,000 registered users, and again, this comes from a wide variety of background, and we get around 130,000 downloads of data worldwide. As I said, UK Data Service is not just for academic researchers. We have a lot of governmental analysts that are using our data, charities and foundations, think tanks as well, or independent research centers. A few of our bigger data sources include national statistical authorities. We provide a lot of data from the Office for National Statistics. It's quite granular data as well, but yet still anonymized, and we provide it as safeguarded data. So anyone that is registered with the service and agrees to our end user license conditions can download and make use of that data. We provide longitudinal studies from the Institute of Socio-Economic Research or the Center for Longitudinal Studies, governmental data such as Department for Work and Pension, the Home Office, and so on. We do have quite a lot of data from individual researchers. Actually, in the last year, we have seen an 80% increase in data received from individual researchers, because of course the open science agenda and the reproducibility agenda is there much more. And in order to receive the funding, you need to demonstrate what you have done with the data previously. We host UK survey data, longitudinal international data as well, especially for bids. If you want to do a comparison, it is very useful to use our international section. We have census data, and actually we've just released, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, the very first 2021 data sets from the census 2021. So we're very, very excited about that. We do provide access to business microdata in admin data, some linked admin data as well, which is, I would say, it's extremely useful because, of course, we have such a variety of data sources. And admin data sometimes has not been very used, but it's getting out there. More and more data sources are coming. And we do have a range of multimedia qualitative data sources. These range from transcripts, semi-structured interviews transcripts, to workshop transcripts, to video materials. I would say most of the qualitative collection, it is usually transcripts data. The data catalog is available to everyone, and anyone can search the data catalog for the data that they are looking for. But also we have a browsing data functionality, which helps if, for example, you're not very aware of a specific study you would like to focus for, but you would like to conduct some research into ethnicity. You can always use our browsing data functionality. Or if the project is more concerned around methodology, or you would like to set up a new project, I don't know, longitudinal study, for example, having a look at our longitudinal collections would be extremely helpful. All the documentation is made available online, so you can actually consult the different questionnaires, user guides that they are providing. And you have mentioned in your introduction, one of the things is, how do I ask the correct research questions, and how do I put the questions within the questionnaire and within the transcripts, interviews? Actually consulting all of these bigger sample size studies helps with harmonization of that information, and all the documentation is available online. As briefly mentioned, we do provide these two different repositories: the curated repository, which is for the large-scale population representative data, but also the research self-deposit repository for smaller scale data. We do encourage everyone to get in touch with us if they have created data. We always help in assessing whether that data can or cannot be archived. So we would never expect if, for example, the participant information sheet or the consent form use is precluding data sharing. Of course, we can make that data available. But is there, for example, and my colleague Hina will go over the ethical and legal bits, is there possibility for retrospective consent? Because again, not sharing that data, we're losing quite a lot, and other researchers are losing. We do offer a 3-tier license framework, which mimics our access framework as well. So the data can be made available as open access, meaning that within that data, there is no real disclosure risk. It's usually made available under Creative Commons license, which allows redistribution, so other researchers can make use of the data, enhance it, for example, create some derived variables and then share it again. Usually most of our data sits under the safeguarded umbrella because there is a potential residual risk of disclosure. So that means that potentially participants in the collection might be identified with some prior knowledge. Again, the risk is very minimal. The data is still considered anonymized as per legislation, and it requires authentication within the UK Data Service system, and sometimes it might have additional conditions on use. Finally, we have the controlled access version, which is where the real risk of re-identification lies, and it usually applies for a lot of business microdata. And here I'm talking about very, very granular. It would even include things like the postcode and the turnover of the specific organization. As I said, the license mimics the access framework, from open access to safeguarded and to controlled access. Registration is needed to, it's very straightforward. If you are part of a higher education or further education institution in the UK, you can log in with your credentials. Otherwise, you can request a username, and our access team are currently processing applications for usernames within 3 working days. You might want to register and download some data for exploratory purposes. That is by all means fine, and we welcome researchers doing that. And we require registration to ensure that researchers treat the data ethically. We make sure that they don't share the data with other people that are not registered with the service. They preserve the confidentiality in the files, and then they delete the data at the end of the project. The highest level of security, it is control data, and we make it available via what we call the 5 safes framework, and it covers safe data. So all the data within this controlled environment is de-identified. So all direct identifiers have been removed, be it name, phone numbers, VAT numbers, and so on. But it's very, very detailed. Safe projects, all the people wishing to access data via the controlled environment, they have to have their projects approved by the data owner because there is this increased risk. Safe people, they need to be accredited researchers and pass the training. And I'm saying pass the training, if by no means difficult, attending the training session and then the test, they're very straightforward to pass. The data is only available within the UKDS Secure Lab, which is a controlled environment. So can't be taken out of that controlled environment. And finally, everything that is being taken out of the controlled environment is checked by our user support and training colleagues for secondary disclosure. So within the tables, is there a risk of re-identification of a participant in the survey? You might ask why, if I create some data, I get in touch with UK Data Service, they say, yes, it's fine, this data can be shared under XYZ conditions. What are the benefits of doing that? There are no costs associated with the deposit whatsoever, and we do guide data owners throughout the process. Everything is online. There's no need to sign licenses or send Word documents. The platform is fully online. We do a lot of resource discovery, and all of our collections receive a persistent identifier, a digital object identifier from DataCite. So that increases the citation of your work, because anyone using your data later on, be it even 10 years from now, they're going to use that DOI. So it increases discoverability. We are part of the consortium of European social science archives. So all the metadata that is within our catalog gets fed into the CESDA catalog for discoverability purposes as well. We provide a wide variety of events. Most of them currently are simply online and they're free to attend. If you're interested in, for example, a specific survey, just this month we have one on the family resources survey. It's a huge, huge survey which might come handy in your own usages, but also for that harmonization purpose. We have a YouTube channel where we make available all event videos, but also some shorter videos about how do I download the data set, or how do I use Nestor to check data. The Learning Hub is fully online, is on our web pages, and we have a variety of information related to research data management, which we're just going into in a couple of moments. New to using data, we have a variety of user guides. If you haven't used data before, for example, survey data, it goes over how do I open an SPSS file? Do I need to weight my data? Why do I need to weight my data? And so on. We do have interactive online data skills modules. Again, all of these are available to everyone, and it's just increasing that knowledge. And we also can help, whether you want to teach with real data, to actually create your own event about the usability of data. How do I make use of it? And of course, please to get in touch with any questions that you might have. We have an online form that can be completed and then triaged and sent to the correct team. A little bit about data management planning and fair data sharing. So it's clear that data usually have a much larger lifespan than within the project they're created. And I think especially with charity organizations, you're doing such a fantastic job in going and talking to harder to reach populations compared to the larger scale surveys. And I think it would be fantastic if that data could be shared, of course, within ethical and legal remit, because some topics might be very sensitive and it might need some access permissions in place. But as long as we have the consent form and the participant information sheet in place, it would be fantastic to have much more of that data made available. And I've heard before, sometimes it's, but I've only conducted 10 interviews. Who is going to use that? A lot of people are going to use that. And I know we have seen that with our reshare collections. They do conduct 10 or 15 interviews, but they are so fantastic and so interesting, the topics that they are covering. And it can range from domestic violence, for example. And yes, here we're talking about a bit of access control when it comes to making the data available, to how people are using benefits. They're fantastic topics, and sharing that data, if possible, would be really good. Who is actually benefiting from you sharing your data? Well, all the researchers are benefiting from sharing their data. We've talked a little bit about the digital object identifier. It increases a lot citation, and it actually helps in the future when you're bidding for another project to show them, look, with this project, 5 other projects have based their conclusion on my data that I've collected before. So you're more likely to receive more money from that. It does provide long-term safe storage for your data. So say, for example, the data is only kept on an institutional machine. That machine goes down. Sadly, it has happened in the past, and all that data has been lost forever. That's quite a pity. It does assist in implementing journal retention policies and enables collaboration as well, because you might get funded by NHS, for example, to conduct a small study with a specific sample. By actually making that data available, you would actually be able, other researchers will be able to get in touch with you for future collaborations on similar topics. Of course, the funding bodies are benefiting because they can actually provide evidence that public funded research is used for the greater good, is made available, other people can use it. It avoids duplication of data collection. And again, as mentioned in the introduction, they are asking around existing data sources. Have you tried to see, can you use existing data sources, or do you actually have to collect all of this new data? And of course, it maximizes return for investment by avoiding this duplication. The public is also benefiting because they're seeing this data is made available. They're seeing that laws and regulations are complied with. As I'm mentioning again, the open science agenda that has been quite high for a very long number of years now. But even for the research participants. So I like to give this example because it went to my heart. A couple of years ago, we've done a workshop with migrants. So back in 2016, the ESRC have done this huge call, collecting data about migrants. How can we help them? How can we make policy reflect what they need and help them? So we've done this workshop and we've invited a couple of migrants. And the very first thing one of them said when they stepped on the stage was, please share my data. I want everyone to know what I'm going through. And it was heartbreaking and heartwarming at the same time, because sometimes, especially with the harder to reach populations, people say, well, they're not going to want their data shared. But no one has actually asked them. So just adding that into your consent form just opens that possibility of sharing the data. Now, it's very important to think of data in the sense of am I going to be able to make use of my own data in 10 years from now, for example? And this is where the FAIR principles come in handy. While they are for publishing data, they actually help you in 10 years' time to make use of the data you've collected. Because if the data is not findable, and here again, we're talking about digital object identifiers, depositing data within a responsible repository, and actually having metadata, so everything that describes the data to a standard that everyone understands, helps making the data findable. Accessible. Accessible refers to who can access the data set, including restrictions, of course. So, for example, only researchers based in NGO organizations and higher and future education organization can access the data. Are there any specific methods or tools in order to access the data? Showing that the metadata is preserved forever, because again, there might be a situation where you've collected a study, retrospective consent, going back to the researchers and asking whether sharing their data is possible might not be feasible. Maybe all personal data has already been destroyed now. But even just making a metadata record, so describing the project that you've done, maybe uploading the topic guides or the interview schedules or questionnaires you've used, increases this accessibility on the data. Making data interoperable. And this is where we're talking about that harmonization. How am I making sure that my questions are okay? Other people can understand them. Repositories can help with that because we use standard vocabularies. For example, with UK Data Service, we have the thesauri for indexing collections. It's called HACCP, and it helps ensuring that there is a standard ontology across all the studies that we make available. And finally, in FAIR, we have reusable, so making sure that the license is recognized at an international level. So I've mentioned, for example, Creative Commons for open data, or an end user license such as the UK Data Service. It has established data quality assurance processes, because if you are depositing your data and making the data available via a repository, a responsible repository, they will actually check your data in-house. So while you might have anonymized the data and you're happy with it, even if you have 5 interviews, you might go over them 5 times, because it is your data and you're so used with it, you might just not see there's still a name in it that shouldn't be, like proper personal information. Responsible repositories are checking all of this data for you as well. There's no changes done on the data without your explicit consent as the data owner. But what they would do, or what we do at UK Data Service, is we get in contact and say, we've discovered that in this transcript, this is included. We would advise that. And if you are giving permission, then we can make the changes. Now, data management planning is not, some people see it as a simply exercise. It's more about thinking, how do I document this entire process? And it's a living document as well, because things might change. You might want, and we've seen that with the pandemic quite a lot. So in the past, a lot of data collection was done face to face. Once the pandemic arrived, it all kind of moved to Zoom, Teams, or any other sort of online or phone tools. So you would write in there, it doesn't have to be very long, it's just a couple of pages that are detailing how are you collecting the information. So are you doing transcripts? Are you doing survey? Are they going to be face to face? Are they going to be online? How are you going to organize the data throughout the project? And again, we're going to see using standard naming for the files is very helpful, so that you, but others understand exactly what the files are, how the data is going to be analyzed, what are you using it for. And now it differs. So you might get projects that are hypothesis based. So I My hypothesis is that sitting on the couch for 10 hours increases blood pressure in the long term run, for example, and I want to collect data that actually explores this. Or it can be the other way around in thinking maybe there is a link between X and Y. I don't quite know, so I'm going to collect a bit more exploratory data to be able to see whether there's a connection or not. The data management plan includes a little bit of information about how the data is going to be preserved as well. So you are collecting this data, say, for an organization that you might be leaving in 3, 4, 5 years' time. Where is that data going to sit? Is it going to be preserved for the long term? Are others going to be able to understand what is kept there? And of course, it does contain the final step. And all of them are, if you are not submitting to a funder, all of them are optional. You don't necessarily have to complete all of them. For a funder, they would be compulsory. So how is the data going to be shared? And it's addressing things like, have you documented the data enough? Is there enough contextual information about the collection of the data? Usually when we're talking about a TMP structure, they mostly look the same and they start with a very brief description of data. And this is both for new and existing data sources. So more and more funders are asking for existing data sources to actually be evaluated. Is there any data that could help with your project existing? And how is your new data going to complement this existing new data? We have the management and curation of data throughout the project. So how am I going to document the data? How am I going to transcribe, for example, if I'm doing interviews, how I'm going to label my data if I'm doing surveys, storage and backup. Where is this data going to be kept during the project time? Is it on an institutional machine? Is it on my own machine? If it is on my own machine, do I have encryption in place? And is it password protected and so on? Legal and ethical consideration. And this is a fantastically important section. And this is why my colleague Hina is going into the legal and ethical considerations a bit more in depth. Because without considering this very in much detail, then you might not be able to make use of that data, especially considering now UK GDPR, processing personal data, storing personal data, and so on. A little bit about data sharing, and finally, responsibility and resources. So if you're doing a project with a couple of colleagues, who is going to be responsible for collecting the data? Of course, it can be multiple people. Who is going to be responsible for documenting the data, for saving the data, and so on? So there's quite a few different funding councils within the UK, and we've just provided a couple of examples. But as we can see, AHRC, CRUK, ESRC, the Department for International Development, all of them are now asking for different types of data management plans. They do provide a lot of information on how to complete these, and they do come in very handy throughout the process of collecting data. We do make available. Our time today is short, and I apologize because I know I am spitting out so much information currently, but all the slides will be made available and all the links should give even further information. We do make available a data management checklist that we hope will come in handy. And again, some of the things might be completely optional for your research, but most of them will apply. So when it comes to existing data sources, besides the data catalog that we've discussed about, I also gave the Gateway to Research. So the Gateway to Research provides a portal for all the UKRI, UK research infrastructure, gateway to research innovation. Gateway to Research portal provides information about all the present and past research grants. And again, this might be, especially from a third sector perspective, a way of finding new different collaborations, because you might find on this page that there's some academic research being funded with quite a lot of resources to actually look at something that's useful for your own research, and they're very happy in sharing information in getting partners into their research. When it comes to new data, we are thinking, what is the volume of the data that we're going to be collecting? What is the data type? Is it quantitative? Is it qualitative? Is it a mix? What are the formats and the standard documentation and metadata that we're going to use it? Do we have specific methodologies that we're going to use for the data collection? And again, looking at that documentation that other studies are making available, it's so in depth, going from the consent and the ethical protocols they've used to how they set up the questions, either in the questionnaires or interview transcripts and so on. And always assessing the source and trustworthiness of third party data. Now, we do have on our website a lot of information around how do we version our files, how do we digitize, how do we organize, how do we transcribe files in a way that it's suitable and makes sense, and also around recommended formats. So, for example, if we're talking about tabular data, we might want to use SPSS or maybe CSV, for example, or if I'm doing some interview transcripts, I might want to be using Word, which can be transformed to rich text format, which is much more usable as it is non-platform dependent. Security and backup. Again, we have heard some stories which initially when heard, they are a bit jaw-dropping. For example, all the data was stored on a non-password protected laptop and the laptop was left on a train. All of that was lost. It was a huge nightmare. It was previous to UK GDPR, so I think that was the luck there a little bit, but still, it's very important to make sure that you do consult it with your institution's policy about, pardon me, how the data is kept, where is it kept, how is it backed up. So again, it depends. Some institutions might use just servers that you and your colleagues have access to. How is the backup going? They usually are able to support researchers quite a lot when it comes to data storage. But we do have further information about encryption of laptops or computers, or making sure that you use encrypted, we call them folders, to deal with the data, especially if it's personal data. And there isn't necessarily a centralized place that you could keep it in your institution. Now, when it comes to management and curation of data, it's always thinking from the perspective of, if someone else would be seeing the final product that I'm creating, this final survey or this final set of transcripts, are they going to be able to understand it? So we're talking about documentation, we're talking about data description, this contextual information. And I've added a couple of screenshots from our website. I chose the Scottish Crime and Justice Survey. I'm a criminology by academic background, so it's usually with the crime ones. I'm like, oh, another one appeared. So what we would be expecting from data study level documentation would be the questionnaires that were used, all the protocols, these user notes that were used, a technical report that covers the methodology that was used, and then we have a couple of data files that we create in-house for use for secondary researchers. Now, data level documentation, if we're talking about qualitative collection, let's say semi-structured interviews, we would expect a data list in here. So we have the study number, and we have interview ID 1. We know their age group, Are they part of a farm scheme and so on? We do make a data list template available that anyone can use. It's available under a CC BY license. And also, if we're using a third-party data that we can share, so again, available under an open license, we do encourage people to use what we call a variable information log that details where this variable is coming from. Can I share it? What is the license that's made available under? Because it ensures others can make use of the data correctly. And finally, we do have catalog metadata. So all of this contextual information about the different they're called the Data Documentation Initiative schema, DDI metadata schema. So we have things like dates of fieldwork, when was the collection created, what is the country the collection is covering for, are there any spatial units, usually applicable to quantitative rather than qualitative data, what were the participants, is it individuals, is it household, is it organization, what is the wide level of the collection? So is it national, international, subnational data? What was the population of the collection and so on? And again, from a secondary researcher perspective, when all of this is put together with the data just makes much more sense. We do have a checklist for how to prepare your data files. And again, while originally these are with the intention of these files will be shared with others, even within your organization. So if you can't share the data outside of your organization because of ethical and legal constraints, it comes helpful for 3, 4, 5 years from now to ensure that the data can be used. We have guidance around anonymization, for quant and qual data. For example, for qual data, we make available a macro tool in Word. It has a user guide. It's very short as well, but it's basically highlighting any words that are starting with a capital letter, so potentially disclosive information such as names, to help you anonymize the files. We have guidance on documenting the data and other documentation resources as well. As I've mentioned, when we're thinking of the data management plan, thinking about the different responsibilities within a project is very important because again, people might move on from one job to another. So knowing who is responsible for what ensures that the project can be completed. We do have guidance on how to cost the data management plan as well, especially if you are looking for funding. Having a look at the guidance on how to cost data management might come in handy in ensuring that you're asking for the resources that you need. Well, I do apologize. I know that is a lot of information. It's filled with links. And let's talk about this and let's talk about that. But I do hope that the presentation is of help to give a wide view of when we're talking about data management, what are we talking about? Why is documentation important? Why is curation important? And I will now stop the sharing of my screen.
My name is Hina, and as Cristina mentioned that we work within the research data management team, and we are based at UK Data Archive, University of Essex, and I work within Cristina's team, and my main responsibility is to oversee the training of ethical and legal aspects of data sharing. And I am having issues with my voice, so bear with me if I stop for a sip of water during my presentation. So let's start. So the overall aim of my session is to show how you can share research data from human participants within ethical and legal boundaries. And in this session, I'll talk you through to the ethical obligations and best practices when it comes to data sharing. And I'll also discuss duty of confidentiality, data protection, and rights inherent in research data and some of the best practices to be legally compliant when sharing data. And I'll also talk you through to the role of consent in research, specifically when it comes to data sharing. And finally, I'll show you some of the useful resources, and I will take your questions at the end. Ethic issues are mostly likely to arise around privacy, equality, diversity, and health and safety. And it is important to adhere to ethical principles in order to protect the dignity, rights, and welfare of research participants. ESRC has set out key principles for ethical research. According to these principles, researchers should ensure that their research is beneficial to participants, individuals, science, society, and be realistic about the benefits that it is likely to deliver. Research should be designed and conducted in a way that respects the rights, interests, values, dignity, and autonomy of participants. Researchers should inform participants that they have a right to refuse to participate, and it should be free of consequences, and they can withdraw from the research for any reason. And integrity demands that there is a clear fit between what researchers say they will do and how they will conduct their research. And transparency means being clear about the nature of the research and communicating this to those involved. So researchers must exercise self-critical responsibility in the planning and conduct of their research. And researchers should maintain the independence of their research, and where conflicts of interest cannot be avoided, they should be made explicit. And independence of research is founded on academic credentials, professional standards, expertise, and experience, and it should be free from personal, organizational, and political bias or dishonesty. And any considerations of gain should be safeguarded at all times. So it is important that researchers do not just consider what can be done with the data. It is equally important that researchers consider what should be done. So some of the best practices are that ethical obligations should be considered throughout the research life cycle, all the way from the planning, research design stage, data collection stage, to the future uses including publications, archiving, sharing, and linking of data. It is also essential to have a knowledge about the standards and requirements of the relevant research organizations. So always comply with the relevant laws, avoid social and personal harm, and you can always check with the data centers like us, as we facilitate or other data centers facilitate ethical and legal reuse of research data, and including protection of participants and safeguarding of personal data. In the UK, there is a duty of confidentiality that is based in common law and that occurs where confidential information comes to the knowledge of a person in circumstances where it would be unfair if it were then to be disclosed to others. So there are some exceptions when you can disclose information. For example, if participant consents to onward sharing of their personal data, then sharing does not breach duty of confidentiality. And sometimes public interest can override duty of confidentiality. So occasionally there are instances when you may need to give up data such as court order. So the best practice is to avoid very specific promises in consent forms. As researchers, we must adhere to data protection requirements when managing or sharing personal data. So if personal information about people is collected or used in research, then the data protection regulation applies. Personal information or data is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. It could be name, address, postcode, and it also includes sensitive personal data or special category data, such as ethnicity, political or religious beliefs, biometric data, or health data. So data protection legislations that are most widely applicable to the research are Data Protection Act, EU GDPR, and the UK GDPR. EU GDPR is the EU-wide data protection regulation that was introduced in 2018 and replaced UK Data Protection Act 2018 that was used until that time. However, after Brexit in the UK, it is now called the UK GDPR. Currently, the UK GDPR and the EU GDPR both are aligned. They place the same legal obligations on researchers. So now if the researcher based in the UK collects personal data about people anywhere in the world, or a researcher outside the UK collect personal data on UK citizens, then DPA and UK GDPR both applies. However, if the researchers are undertaking research projects which span across the EU, then the EU GDPR will also need to be considered. So under the UK GDPR, there are 6 possible grounds for processing personal data, and one of these must be present. These are consent, public interest, legitimate interest, protection of vital interests, legal obligation, and performance of a contract. However, in the context of research, the first 3, which are consent, public task, or legitimate interest, are the most applicable grounds for the processing of personal data. But usually, consent is considered as the most widely used ground. Public interest or public task is being used as well by the academic researchers, but it has some conditions attached to it. So there is a misconception that data protection laws such as GDPR prohibits data sharing. However, it does not prevent data sharing as long as you approach it in a sensible and proportionate way. GDPR is useful for research as it legalizes much of the current good practice in research, placing people at the center, and it offers enhanced rights to the individuals whose data is being processed. So in the context of research, GDPR has the potential to further benefit research and archiving, helping to improve trust and confidence between the researchers and their participants. Much research data, even sensitive data, can be shared ethically and legally if researchers employ certain strategies, for example, offering protection of identities through anonymization, which is a process of removing direct and indirect identifiers. And direct identifiers include name, address, and indirect identifiers are like profession, salary, job title, or any outliers in the data, which when combined can identify a person. So using processing ground for personal data and regulating access are 2 other options. And yeah, so I'm not going to go into details for anonymization. I have added a link into the resource slide at the end where my colleague is running a workshop, I think it's next month, where you can have detailed information on anonymizing qualitative and quantitative data. So the second one is the consent. Now I'll go through it quickly. So as I mentioned earlier, consent plays an important role when it comes to data sharing. So I'm sure you all are familiar with what informed consent is. Informed consent is one of the founding principles of research ethics, and it aims at ensuring that human participants can enter research freely with full information about what it means for them to take part. And in the research context, consent is obtained to ensure that participants understand what they are signing up to, making participation and research more effective. It also ensures that the research conducted is ethical and compliant with the data protection regulation. So in research context, we need consent for two purposes: consent for research participation, which is considered as one of the founding principles of research, where it is sought before participation in any research activity and for all participants. It usually involves providing information regarding study purpose, risk, benefits, voluntary participation, and so on. However, consent can also be used to comply with the data protection regulation. And if a researcher collects, manages, and shares personal data, then consent of the data subject can be used as a legal base to process this personal information under the UK GDPR. So I have added a link to the UK Data Service Model Consent Form on the last slide, as well as here on this slide, so that you can have a look in your own time. However, I thought I should mention few issues here. For example, if personal information is collected, best practice is to provide information about how personal information will be processed and stored and for how long. Procedures for maintaining confidentiality, whether real names will be used or not, if data will be anonymized, if so, how it will be anonymized. It should also state procedures for ensuring ethical use of the data, especially in the context of archiving and reuse. And if the GDPR applies, then further information needs to be provided in the consent form, such as the contact details of the data controller. Data controller is the entity that determines the reason for processing personal data. It could be a data protection officer, RVO, or a researcher themselves. Consent form should also state who will receive or have access to the personal data. It should also have a clear statement on the rights of the participants, because participants can request to access their data. They may ask for corrections or removals of their personal data. So these need to be communicated to the participants. However, you may use some in the information sheet and some information in the consent form. Basically, you can break down the information into three key areas: information related to participation in the research, how the information collected will be used by the researcher, and information about future uses by the researcher or by other researchers if data would be shared. So this is the screenshot from the UK Data Service Model Consent Form template. It pays particular attention to ensure that research data can be curated and made available for future use, as well as addressing all standard requirements of a consent form. For example, this section in the template is about taking part in the study. I'll let you read it quickly. Here you can see that it has captured several aspects, such as participants have read and understand the information. It has captured an aspect related to voluntary participation. They can withdraw anytime. It also explains what they have to do, how information is being collected, or if there are any potential risks. So this section is about the uses of information or data being collected. It also addresses the confidentiality aspect by asking what can or cannot be shared. I let you read it first. So if you have noticed, it has some specific statements regarding qualitative data. For example, a statement on if you want to make use of a quote in research outputs or named quotes or a statement on copyright in the context of written information, such as diaries, etc. So this section is informing the participants about future use and reuse of the information or data. All the information, where the data will be deposited, in which form, whether it is anonymized or if available under restrictions, and so on. We don't usually advise that you put until you are sure that you are going to deposit your data into such and such repository. Don't mention it in the name of the repository in the consent form. So I have added as I said earlier, that I have added a link to the model consent form on the resources slide, so that you can have a look at it later. And as I mentioned earlier, regulating access to the data for future use is another available option. And I'm not going into detail because Cristina has covered that already. So if you are collecting or working on using secondary data sources, then you need to consider certain rights inherent in research data. Two most relevant types of rights applicable to secondary data are copyright and database rights. Copyright or IP rights are assigned automatically to the creator or the researcher who owns the data. When data are shared or archived, the original owner retains the right. So data archive cannot archive data unless all right holders are identified and give permission for their data to be shared. Always remember that information in the public domain does not mean that copyright does not apply. And according to the UK's copyright and rights in database regulation, a database is a collection of independent works arranged in a systematic way. So it is a possibility that the database rights may apply when it comes to data sharing. So if you are using secondary sources, then best practice is to assess who the copyright holder of the data set is. If using databases, are there any database rights? Are you allowed to use them, and in what way? Are you allowed to archive and publish them in a data repository? Most of the time, we encounter problems when researchers are allowed to use these data, as the data is under open license, or they register to use it for their personal use. But what they do not realize is that it is accessible to them for their use, but they need permission from the data owner for sharing it or archiving it. So you may need to seek for further permission to distribute it. So the best practice is to be legally compliant is always investigate early which laws apply to your data, including cross-country collaborative working, as there might be a country-specific variations. As I mentioned earlier, that always avoid collecting personal or sensitive data if not essential to your research. It is always helpful if you start planning regarding these issues from the onset of your research, and you can always seek advice from us or from your research office. Always ensure by having discussions with your participants that they understand how their data will be used. And finally, remember that not all research data is personal. For example, anonymized data is not personal data. So here I have added all the useful resources, including the link to the UK Data Service training and events page, where you can find information on upcoming events and slides of past events. I have also added a link to our, I think Cristina has also added it to her slides, the YouTube channel link, where you can watch videos on all the topics we are going through today. And we run regular workshop workshops on all these issues, and the videos of these workshops are on this channel. Now my voice is cracking. So these are some of our upcoming training events in the month of October and November, covering in depth all these issues in depth. So if anyone is interested, they can register to attend these events.